Hi, I'm Jacob Wilbanks. On August 18th, 2020, I entered my very first game jam. 2 weeks later, I won. How? Well, firstly, I joined the jam. No. Next, I assembled a small team of me and my two friends, Wilson and Jalti, both an artist and an experienced level designer respectively. Then, within a few days, Danny's Basement Jam officially began. The theme? You are what you consume. The most important thing I did at the start was realize my limitations. With only 3 of us working on the game, and only having 4 days to complete it, there were going to be a lot of challenges. We weren't going to be able to make some hour-long, infinitely replayable, fun, story-driven, action-packed game. We had to set our sights on something very reasonable and attainable. So, we decided to make a linear, about 20-minute tile-based puzzle game. I also knew that I needed the game to be relatively bug-free and pretty polished, so we focused on a select few mechanics instead of trying to add in every single idea that we came up with. By doing this, we drastically reduced the amount of bugs and the amount of errors that could happen while a player plays the game. The player would take control of a wizard, who moves food along a tile-based grid on top of a table. When the object you are controlling comes into contact with another piece of food, you then take control of both. This simple mechanic allowed a lot of ideas to stem from. The next morning, me and my level designer hopped on a call and we started brainstorming design mechanics, like mold, that whenever you come into contact with it, it actually turns the food into mold too, or an eclair that shoots laser beams and destroys blocks. You get the idea. With a simple concept, you can expand on it easily and consistently. We also had the idea of having some sort of boss fight at the end of the game, but we didn't have enough time to actually implement that. As you build the game, you're going to have to constantly be making sacrifices to make sure that you get a finished product in on time. You'll have plenty of great ideas, but the hard part is limiting those ideas to the best ones that are the easiest to implement. Remember, a simple finished game is pretty much always going to be better than some unfinished, giant, complex mess. Next, if you're the leader of the project, realize that your attention is a very finite resource. You have team members, so use them. You have to delegate the workload. The very first thing I did, once we had the base design down, was assign roles to each team member. I created a rough overview of the pacing and when I wanted mechanics introduced, but I let my level designer have complete control over the individual level's layout. I used Unity's collab feature to constantly be updating my level designer with new mechanics and new tools he can use to design levels. No coding was required on his part. All he had to do was drag and drop and rearrange the levels, much like an actual designer would be doing. It took a huge weight off my shoulders, because while I was coding the next mechanic, I knew someone else was already designing levels and bug testing that mechanic so that I didn't have to. I could focus solely on coding. This method allowed us to produce 20 levels over the course of less than 2 days. He ended up using these mechanics in ways that I'd never even thought of. This allowed us not only to squeeze more content out of the game, but also to fix several bugs that I would not have even found on my own. As for my artist, I gave him a simple list of every single asset we needed for the game and ranked them by importance. This not only allowed him to manage his time better, but it also allowed him to focus his artistic creativity into the assets that were going to be used the most often. It is extremely important for every single person working on the game to be on the same page as to where it's going. This may seem really obvious, but it's something I've actually struggled with in the past. If you talk to my artist, he could tell you a million horror stories of times I've had a vague, creative idea and asked him to produce art for it without giving him any real direction. This is the worst thing you can do for an artist. They need to know what their job is in order to do it. Duh. Do not be how I used to be. Give them a clear direction while still allowing them to take creative control into their own hands. Believe me, your team members will thank you. This leads us to playtesting. Every single time my designer sent me a group of new levels, instead of sitting down and playing them myself, I would instead grab my girlfriend and have her play them and watch over her shoulder. Having people that don't know a lot about gaming play your games is one of the best ways to gain perspective onto what you're actually working on. Game designer Shigeru Miyamoto actually coined this term, and he calls it the waifu-meter. If a complete outsider can grasp the concepts of your game quickly and have fun playing it, you are doing your job perfectly. Now, if your playtester fails to grasp the concepts of your game, realize that it is literally in no way their fault. As game designers, a huge portion of our job is to actually communicate to the players through the game how to properly experience and enjoy the game. Thankfully, Jalti, my level designer, did a pretty good job integrating these mechanics into a way that was cohesive and made sense for experienced and new players. The more playtesting you do, and the wider variety of playtesters you include, the more streamlined and consistent your gameplay experience will be. On the fourth and final day before submission, I focused solely on polish. When you plan your workout, you need to leave a good space of time at the end to work on finishing touches. If you finish the last level of your game right before you submit the project, chances are there's gonna be some glaring flaws with the pacing and the levels. Since we had already smoothed out the levels beforehand, I was allowed to completely focus my energy that day on polish. So what do I mean by polish? First, I made a cute little transition between the main menu and the start of the game. It might seem small, but the more little details like this you add, the more flair and character your game will have. Details like this are not only pretty easy to implement, but also rarely result in bugs, making them perfect finishing touches for the last few hours before submission. After making that level transition, I set aside an hour to work on the 3 musical tracks I would be using for the game. Next, I had my girlfriend help me out by making sound effects for when the lizard was eating his food at the end of each level. Then, I made the general game sound effects by layering a few samples I found in FL Studio and adding some pretty major audio effects to them. And just like that, before I knew it, it was 7 AM, and the game was due in an hour. I didn't really know what to do, so I just tried to play as many of the games as I could. Every game I played, which was about 25 of them, I gave a pretty fair rating and then left a comment, just a few sentences explaining some critiques, and then what I liked about the game. Honestly, this is probably the reason I won. When you give constructive and positive criticism to people, chances are they're gonna do the same back. Nobody is going to play every single jam, so it's important you get as many eyes on your game as you can while the rating period is still up. I also shared the game with a lot of my friends, and while they couldn't rate the game, they left a lot of comments, which actually boosted the ranking it had in the popular tab of the game sorting categories. I can't thank my fellow jam participants enough for checking my team's game out and rating it as well as they did. There were a lot of really cool games submitted, and I've got some of my favorites linked in the description. If you're interested in this kind of stuff, I highly recommend going out and entering a jam of your own. Your goal shouldn't solely be to win, but to make something you're proud of with people who enjoy game design as much as you. It was stressful and hard, but it was also really fun, and very rewarding, even before the results came back. To play my team's game, Dinner for a Lizard Wizard, click the first link in the description. Obviously, I couldn't be more thankful to my team members, Jalty and Will, without whom the game would not have gotten nearly as far as it did and probably never even would have been completed. Also, a huge thank you to Michael Sorensen, Mini Devs, Pineapple Turnover, and of course Danny for hosting this whole thing and allowing 96 teams of people to come together and produce something really, really cool. To see the future projects I work on, follow me on YouTube and on itch.io. If you're into this sort of thing, follow me on whatever social poison you use. I'm actually working on a new project right now that I'm really excited to show you guys.